Hi everybody, how are you doing? Hi everybody online. Apologies for making you wait for about 8 minutes pies. Thank you everybody for coming along to the second School of Health and Wellbeing Christmas Lecture. So my name is Donald and I'm from the Department of Public Health and the School of Health and Wellbeing. We are assigned today by the excellent Liz McCluskey. Thank you very much, Liz. So the Christmas Lecture is something that's done by a number of universities, and the idea is that it's meant to be enjoyed by everybody, so not just scientists and academics, but the world at large. There is a breadth of high-quality, world-changing research that goes on at the University of Glasgow, but part of the task here is to find a truly engaging speaker that can involve the listener. And as anyone who has sat through an academic conference can attest, that's actually quite a task. It's far less common. So, Professor Helen Minnis is Professor of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry at the University of Glasgow. I'm quoting bio here. She has a long-standing clinical and research focus on the psychiatric problems of abused and neglected children. Currently, her focus is on intervention research, including a randomised control trial of infant mental health service for young children in foster care, the randomised control trial of dyadic developmental psychotherapy for school-aged children in adopted or foster placements. She is also conducting behavioural genetic research focused on the role of abuse and neglect and its overlap with neurodevelopment across the life course. She has collaborations with colleagues at the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology and Neuroscience at King's College London, the Universities of Aalborg and Aarhus, Denmark, and with the Gilberg Neuropsychiatry Centre, Sweden. Helen's title may say Professor of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry at the University of Glasgow, but she doesn't feel that adequately defines her entire research character. She uses a range of tools and approaches to study what she is drawn to. Helen's interest comes from working at the sharp end of dealing with trauma and abuse, and works backward from that towards the study of attachment. Helen's fundamental focus, although it wouldn't fit on a business card, is what can go right or wrong in human relationships. But Professor of what can go right or wrong in human relationships is not very snappy, unfortunately. Helen enjoys the collaboration and curiosity of being a scientist, not citations of what will necessarily get into the top journals. A downside of becoming professor, she says, is that people, particularly early career colleagues, can have a bit of inhibition towards what they will say to you. As a non-professor, I can personally attest to this because I am not a professor and I'm told I'm wrong often. Helen became drawn to this area through some serendipity. She got the job for 13 months working at an orphanage in Guatemala. She is keen to emphasise that this was not a grand plan. It was who would get her a job. She observed that the children in the orphanage displayed very different characteristics to the children outside, even though those in the orphanage had better facilities, running water and food. There must be something else driving that beyond basic human facilities. Helen brought 3 volumes of Bowlby's works on attachment, because as she put it, hey, you need something to write on that trip. Personally, I dispute that anybody who brings 3 volumes of anything on a flight would be determined as a casual enthusiast. But I digress. Having looked today, the quickest flight in 2024 from Glasgow to Guatemala is tomorrow at 6:05 AM via Amsterdam. It takes 19 hours and 5 minutes, and I think you could get through at least 1.5 volumes if you are an aspiring child psychologist. Perhaps switched on a Kindle. Helen observed that in Guatemala in the 90s, we didn't talk to children about their experiences. In the UK, we did and still do. Who is to say who is right? Helen was told by her mentor, a nutritionist, to focus, focus, focus for career prosperity. That is not the way she really is. She is driven by curiosity and an enjoyment of being surprised. She says, if nothing ever surprised you in research, it wouldn't be as fulfilling or, and I quote here, entertaining. I'm therefore delighted to introduce Professor Helen Minnis, who will give this year's Christmas lecture. Helen?
All I was actually inviting you to do is to disagree at every point. So please do. I'm absolutely delighted and honoured to be asked to do this. And it's actually got me in a really Christmassy mood. And I thought I would start off by just thinking about what Christmas is. We often think of Christmas as being a family time, lots of food, lots of love, lots of fun, and also multi-sensory. irritating Christmas music sometimes. But if you're not feeling really part of a family, or if you've just been dumped, or things are not going really, really well, then Christmas can be quite a difficult time. This is just a version of Jingle Bell. And I think that's difficult. And it's not just Christian religious festivals that this is true of. So my husband, who's here somewhere, has had the really interesting experience over the last few years of celebrating Ramadan with Muslim colleagues that he works with every day. But of course, I'm not Muslim, so I'm sitting eating my mince and tatties at 6 o'clock in the evening. It's not got dark yet, and that is quite a lonely thing. It's actually quite hard to do Ramadan alone. So for these religious festivals, it really is about being together. It's togetherness. And of course, that contrast can be really difficult, especially if you're the person that's on the outside looking in. But what that tells me is that as humans, we are herd animals. This could easily be my family in the Caribbean. So my dad's side of the family, they're from the Bahamas. And they're in the Bahamas, if you go to the Bahamas, everyone's called Minnis. And everyone's who's not Minnis is your sister, cousin, auntie, child. So wherever you go, you're going to get a hug. And actually being a city girl, that can be actually a little bit overwhelming at times. But we are really made as humans to live in groups, just like many other species. So like meerkats, like horses, like cows, like humans. We are fundamentally just animals, herd animals. But those groups, those social groups that we live in, are made up of individual relationships, and the primary individual relationship is children and their primary caregivers, and the mothers, the fathers, other carers, and those relationships carry on for better, for worse. With luck, they'll carry on right into old age, and we'll continue to have those loving relationships. And it's really when things are hard, when things are most difficult, that's when we want to be close, and we need to get close. I've been studying attachment for years, and the more I study and think about attachment, the more I realise it's fundamentally about safety in numbers. And you see this across species. So this is a flock of birds. And if someone comes out with a gun and starts shooting, the birds that are in the centre of the flock are going to be safer because they're part of the flock. Same for swarms of bees. These are rats in a barrel that have had a fright, and they clump together, and that's natural. We get together when we're frightened. And that's back to our hypervigilant meerkats looking out and checking, but sticking in a group. And we know from times in history when things have been extremely difficult that this is what we do as humans. So this is Londoners during the Blitz getting together to sleep overnight in the underground. And of course, we have some terrible conflicts at the moment. This is a recent newspaper photograph from the Middle East. And in these terrible conflicts, we get together, we stick together, we have to stick together. It's what we do. And that leads to attachment theory. So attachment theory was, I think, one of the greatest insights of the 20th century. In some ways, attachment theory it's been noticed probably well before that. But the attachment process goes a bit like this. If a young infant is anxious, then they will exhibit attachment behaviours. And in human infants, attachment behaviours include crying. So those of you who've got kids, the minute your baby is born, you'll hear that baby crying. You'll probably very quickly be able to work out who is your baby. As the baby gets older, they'll reach out to be picked up. When they're even a little bit older, they'll run after their primary caregivers. And the whole purpose is proximity seeking. It's all about making sure those special adults who are there to look out for you can come close in difficult situations when you're hungry, when you're tired, when you've had a fright. And if that works well, then you'll get comfort from your caregiver. And to be honest, ordinarily, it does work well. I mean, that's a complete human instinct. It's the baby's instinct to exhibit the attachment behaviours, and it's the carer's instinct to offer these caregiving behaviours. You kind of can't help it. It kind of comes from our guts. And if it all works well, then there'll be a reduction in anxiety, and that's a cycle that goes over and over and over throughout life. And this was the brainchild of two of, I think, the greatest scientists of the 20th century, John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth. Mary Ainsworth was John Bowlby's PhD student, but she really took his work forward in a fantastic way. They were both out-of-the-box thinkers. They were both people who really were able to kind of step outside their comfort zones. John Bowlby, for example, took time out of his work as a psychiatrist and psychoanalyst. He was based at the Tavistock Clinic in London, but he took time out for a year to work with animal behaviourists. By the way, these noises have been happening all day. I think it's because Big Brother's watching us. But I've been told on good authority that they're just fixing something. Yeah, so John Bowlby took time out. He spent time with animal behaviourists, including Harry Harlow. And you've probably heard about Harlow's monkey experiments. These are very famous, depressing experiments where little baby monkeys in a cage without their mums were offered two different kind of solutions. One was a rigid metal pole that they could get food from, and the other was what you see in the picture, which was a kind of comfortable monkey-like thing, kind of vaguely monkey-like, but it didn't have any food, and they always went for a cuddle. So they actually chose that closeness with something that looked like a mum over food, and that was a really important insight. And John Bowlby really moved thinking on from internal object relations, where it was all about internal drives, to the external world. And actually, he was thrown out of the British Psychoanalytic Society because of that. So it was a very radical theory back in the day. And Mary Ainsworth was also an out-of-the-box thinker. So she came from kind of semi-rural Midwest in the States. And she worked at the Tavistock Clinic as a PhD student with John Bowlby. But back in the 1950s, if you're a woman and your husband got a job somewhere else, you just had to stop everything and follow your husband. Her husband got a job in Uganda. But she then did some of her best work, and she observed parent-infant behaviour in Ugandan families. And she wrote this wonderful book called Infant Care and the Growth of Love. And that was what really set attachment behaviour on a research footing. So Mary Ainsworth developed the strange situation procedure, which I think, and I've thought for years, is really one of the most brilliant techniques of the 20th century. So essentially, it's a very rigorous 20-minute or so laboratory technique where you've got the baby or toddler in a laboratory playroom with their mum. And there's 3-minute segments, and they're very well timed. And you have to orchestrate this. If you actually do a strange situation, you feel like the mother of the bride. You're kind of getting everybody in the right place and getting everything timed. But there's different segments. They called it a drama in 8 episodes. So there's a moment when you've got mum and baby in the room. There's a moment when you've got a stranger and the baby, and there's a moment when the baby's on their own. And that's all very stressful for a little one. You can measure it. And the amazing thing about the strange situation procedure, it's been used all over the world. It's even been used in temporary accommodation in a shantytown in Kailicha, which is a shantytown outside Cape Town. And they did this fantastic prevalence study. So in some ways very portable. But the thing about attachment, and again, as I was saying earlier, the more I've learned about attachment, the more I've realised it's actually quite simple. It's fundamentally all about soothing and calibrating your stress responses, kind of regulating yourself. And of course, with baby, sorry, I've just brought my wee pal Lawrence. Lawrence has been with me in quite a few lectures over the years, and he gets quite upset sometimes. So what I do is I just soothe him. And of course, that's what you do when a young baby is upset. you move and you move them rhythmically up and down. You might talk quite sweet. You might stroke them. And that helps the baby to regulate. A quiet baby. There's a fantastic, if you're interested in this, there's a fantastic organisation called the Centre on the Developing Child at Harvard University. And what they've done is they've turned some of these concepts around attachment and human relationships into fairly simple metaphors. And one of the most useful ones is serve and return, which is essentially a tennis metaphor. And the idea is that if you look at videos of parent-infant interaction, it's the baby who always gets to serve. So the baby serves and the parent responds. So let's try this with Lawrence. So Lawrence would go, and I'd go, ah! So it's Lawrence that has the prerogative to start the conversation. And in a stressful situation, it's the baby that exhibits behaviours, and it's us as parents who respond with caregiving behaviours. Parents are caregivers. This is basic human instinct. It's easy when nothing gets in the way. So I'm going to show you a short video clip from a strange situation procedure. And this is a securely attached little girl. And secure attachment is the kind of most optimum type of attachment. You can hear the voices of the attachment researchers behind the screen. So they bring mum round to the back to be able to look through. So the men in the grey jackets, they're the attachment researchers. Actually John Bowlby's son who was in there. But the interesting thing about secure attachment is I initially thought it would be a kind of clingy thing. It's actually the opposite. I mean, the baby makes a really concerted effort to get parent or carer back, and then they're very quickly calmed. Now I'm going to show you 3 short clips of a similar situation with a little boy who's experienced really quite major difficulties in early life, and he's now in foster care. And he's been with this foster dad for long enough to develop a secure attachment. But watch what happens when dad suddenly leaves the room because he needs the toilet. Oh, and I should say, this is even more stressful for this little one because there's a stranger in the room. So there's one of our research assistants in the room who this wee boy has just met. Watch for the attachment behaviour. So just think what that little girl did. She made a lot of noise and she cried. Look what this wee one does. See if you just go around, just go straight. Then there was a bit of an awkward situation because the box of toys that the wee boy's only supposed to get when his foster dad's there. So Rebecca takes them away, and they have to, you know. The little boy's left hand, and Alessandra, I remember Alessandra. You telling me that's a classic sign of stress. So this is a very little boy. But he's managing to be quite polite, despite the fact that his wee heart will be beating. Let's look at what happens when his foster dad comes back into the room. That wee girl. He's looking at Rebecca, he's looking at his foster dad, doesn't know who to go to. The really worrying thing about that is really the least kind of optimum attachment behaviour that you want to see. It's very, very muted. This wee boy's not getting soothed in the way that he should be getting soothed because he's really, really stressed. And yet, if you were to blink, you'd miss it. You wouldn't even notice that there was any problem there. So, I mean, look at that wee face. Look at that wee face. How does that make you feel? It's really awful, isn't it? You want to do something about that wee girl, but actually, that is entirely healthy. That's what you want to see when children's parents leave the room. So, what happens if things do go very badly wrong in the early years, as they did for that little boy? Are you doomed? Absolutely not. I would say that definitively. Absolutely not. And actually, the more I worked with abused and neglected wee ones, the more I realised that there's just a whole range of responses to that. And then a few years ago, somebody pointed out this paper to me that came out in 2011 called the Adaptive Calibration Model of Stress Responsivity. And I think this is a fantastic paper. And it's got this wonderful quote, which is that children have evolved to respond in biologically adaptive ways to harsh and unsupportive family environments, not just to loving and supportive ones. When you think about it, that makes perfect sense. You know, we've got this really complex physiology with our stress response system, we've got our autonomic nervous system, we've got our fight and flight responses. That is all there to help us to cope. We're made to cope. And actually, most children respond really positively to difficulties. And the way that my kind of I like to use a fairly simple metaphor for this, which is a thermostat. It's a bit like the thermostat in your house, which you try and keep the temperature at a reasonable level. If you think about being sluggish and sleepy, so you're at the kind of absolute lowest point of alertness. You've just woken up, you've not had your coffee yet. That is not the moment before you even get out your pajamas to try and do an essay or to do your theory test, if you're trying to learn to drive. You want to get yourself a bit more alert before you do that. You want to get yourself into the optimum zone of flow. And you all know that feeling of, you're ready to learn, you're alert. But if you go too far over into the red, if you get too stressed, then you get brain freeze. And if it gets even worse, so imagine something really, really terrifying happens, as will happen to all of us at some point in our life. Imagine you have a car accident. You go into fight, flight, or freeze. And those states, fight, flight, and freeze, are completely normal. So depending on your personality and your experiences, if somebody rams into the back of the car, you might be the kind of person that wants to jump out and punch them. I'm being completely agnostic as to which kind of person I am. Or you might want to run away before the police get here. Or you might actually freeze. You might just be like a rabbit in the headlights, or kind of almost playing dead. And these are all normal physiological responses to extreme stress. It could be a car accident, it could be the death of a loved one, it could be the sudden death of a loved one, it could be being shouted at by your boss. We will all have experienced things that make us respond in these ways. And then we go into relaxation and restitution. And that is going to keep happening over and over during our development. And this is healthy development. And this is kind of training our systems so that we become robust to challenges. So a bit of trauma is normal. And of course, the way we deal with these stressors throughout life is going to depend on how old we are. So, for Lawrence's age, you've got to have a big soothing person to help you calm yourself. But over development, we start to be able to do this for ourselves. And what you've got on the right-hand side of the slide there is a picture of an elderly Norwegian woman in her summer house. And across cultures, we've all got different ways of getting our systems back into restitution. And back to the strange situation briefly. This is a way of measuring robustly measuring what children do in situations of stress in a way that you could basically give the same dose of stress to a child in Birmingham, Belgium, and Luxembourg, wherever you want. But what I did want to say about the strange situation is although it's a very robust tool and it's been used in hundreds of studies, it's very expensive. It's very, very time consuming. So I was talking about the 20 minutes it takes to actually conduct it like a mother of the bride. But after that, you've then got to rate it. So you video the whole 20-minute interaction. And it takes then at least an hour to rate the video. But in order to be qualified to rate the video, you've got to go to Minnesota for 2 weeks and actually pay a huge amount of money to learn how to do it. And people often fail. So this is a really prohibitively expensive tool. And I think, personally, I'm really concerned that if we don't find a quicker and easier way of measuring attachment, this amazing 20th century tool is going to die out. There are slightly quicker and easier ones, and there are also tools that you can use with slightly older children. So we've used a tool called the Manchester Child Attachment Story Task, and this is like Blue. Does anyone remember Blue Peter? Anyone as old as me? Blue Peter. It's like, here's one I prepared earlier. With the Manchester Child Attachment Story Task, you would use a mummy doll and a child doll. So there's Jack in the front. I might say, Jack doll, what would you normally play? I'm not going to ask you to do this because I didn't tell him I was going to embarrass him. But say Jack doll was going to play football. Jack doll would be running about and suddenly he falls and he hurts his knee and it's bleeding. You have to kind of wind the child up into a state of moderate stress. And at that point, at the crisis point of the story, you give the dolls to the child and you say, show me and tell me what happens next. A securely attached child will just bring mummy doll close, she'll sort things out and make it all better. And an insecurely attached child will do things that are slightly less optimal. Things might get worse. It might suddenly not have just been a skin knee, you might need an ambulance, or mummy doll might just not be involved at all and the child might go and put a plaster on for themselves. And these are all insecure ways of responding. So that is something that some clinicians do use in the clinic. But even with the MCAS, Manchester Child Attachment Story Task, you've still got to go and get it, you've got to go and train to become a rater, and then it still is probably going to take you about an hour to rate each one of these videos. So it's just prohibitively burdensome to do in a clinical situation. So this is where I feel like I'm telling stories, Christmas stories, not long after the turn of the 21st century. A group of us decided to try and speed things up. And we developed a computerised Manchester Child Attachment Story Task, and you can see our lovely computerised doll's house. And on the computer, the child could basically then take the mouse and move the dolls around on the screen. The only problem was, even though it was quite easy to use and you could do 4 or 5 MCAS at the same time in a classroom, you still had to rate the back end of it, and it still took a long time. So it just wasn't really that cost effective. It's going to help a bit, but it wasn't going to be cost effective enough to get a company to turn this into something. So then Stephen Brewster and Alessandro Vincarelli, who's in the audience today, he decided to try and bring this even further into the 21st century. We've developed something called the School Attachment Monitor, which was based on the computerised Manchester Child Attachment Story Task, but actually we ended up with an even simpler kind of interface for the child. So basically what you've got there is a laptop, and you've got flat, fuzzy felt doll's house in front. That flat, fuzzy felt doll's house was the brainchild of Maggie Rooksby, who was the research assistant. So you basically got actors telling the child story stem on the computer, you know, this kind of what's going to happen type of story. And then at the crisis point of the story, the child picks up the dolls, which are just there in front, and tells the rest of the story using the doll's house. That works really, really well. But the tricky thing is that the dolls themselves had movement centres buried in their tummies. So when the child picked up the dolls, if they smoothly brought mummy doll close, you would get a really smooth, rapid movement trace. And if they didn't, then you might get a jerky, slow movement trace or whatever. So you could tell the difference hopefully between secure and insecure attachment. And then there was also a lot of laborious work that went on actually mapping the child's key points on the child's face, on the child's joints, so you could actually trace all of these movements. And what we found was that an artificial intelligence algorithm agreed 80% of the time, approximately 80% of the time, with the human rating of the videos of the way the children interacted on this computerized doll's house, which I thought was pretty good, especially since when we rated all of the videos that you could see the child on the webcam, and you could see their hand movements and things, and the way they moved the dolls around. When we used the original human rating and we worked out how many hours it had taken us as a team to rate all these videos, we worked out it was about 500 hours of rating. I mean, that's just, who's got the time for that? Who's got the money for that? And although these algorithms were really quite laborious to set up, once they were set up, they could offer instantaneous rating. One thing I should say, and I know, Alessandro, you would say this if you were standing up here, the aim is not to replace the human. So the aim is to basically get the AI algorithms to do the kind of boring, repetitive tasks and actually free you up as a researcher or a clinician to actually use your head and think about what's happening in front of you. So could we measure these kinds of things in real babies? And actually, Professor Sam Wass, who works at the University of East London and Oxford University, is trying. So this is some of Sam's kit, and I'll just talk you through some of it. So he uses this with real babies and toddlers in his baby lab. You've got a little pack that's about 6 centimetres in length. You've got a camera, you've got GPS, you've got a microphone, you can measure the proximity between parent and child with this. You've even got heart monitors so that you can look at the degree to which the child is kind of physiologically aroused. And you've got actigraphy so you can actually measure the child's movements. And you can measure the adults, all of this in the adult as well. So you can put a little pack in a little front pack with the adult. And then you can have a reciprocal one for the baby. But the problem is, they're actually also trying to develop little romper suits with body accelerometers in them, which is quite cool. But the problem is, you still got a lot of data to analyse. So you've got to analyse the heart rate trace, you've got to analyse the GPS, etc., etc. It's still extremely laborious. So can we use AI for this? And this is something that we've been thinking about a lot in Glasgow and beyond. So Alessandro and his colleague Marwa Mahmood are working out the social CDT at the School of Computing Science here at the University of Glasgow. And we had been chatting for a number of years with Carlo Schingel and Pascal Fearon. So Carlo is at the University of Amsterdam and Pascal Fearon's at the University of Cambridge. And I think initially they were, I think it's fair to say, unsure about whether AI could really help. Although, to be fair, I think Pascal had been thinking about it. But Carlo has now got a big grant called Aim to Care, which is going to be looking at AI in strange situation and basically trying to bring technology into attachment. So it's really exciting times. We've got 2 PhD students, Andre and Zejian, who are both working very hard on our parent-infant videos. So mapping all of the joints and the facial features in both mum and baby. And one of the things, I mean, you hear about AI and it sounds like, it sounds like a kind of instantaneous solution, but the amount of work that goes into actually developing these algorithms is phenomenal. So just one of the challenges that Andre and Zejian have had to overcome is, what do you do to make sure that you can always tell the difference between the baby and the mum? Now that sounds like so ridiculous, but if you're looking at, say you had a laboratory like this room and you had a mum and a baby moving around, or a toddler moving around in the room, there may be a point where the baby is right in front of the camera and the mum's way in the corner. And actually, if the computer can just see a body, how does that computer tell that whether that, which is bigger? It's going to look as if the baby's bigger. So what you do is you create a bounding box. And with the kind of frames where you can really see them separated, that should help you to always tell the difference. So really painstaking, meticulous work to develop these algorithms. But the kinds of things that Andrea and Zhejian have already been doing is to look at, for example, the total amount of speech in a video of parent-infant interaction, to focus on child speech, separate from parent speech, then to focus on parent speech, separate to child speech, to look at movement and proximity between the baby and the mum, or the dad, whoever is the main caregiver, or the foster carer in our videos. And then using multimodal algorithms, so actually trying to kind of overlay these different types of information to develop even more useful algorithms. So what I would say is, hot off the press, this approach seems to work. We've actually had some really quite good results with these individual types of data, and we're just really in the process of trying to pull this together. So watch the space. Hopefully in a couple of years we'll have some nice data coming out of this. So this is just some of the technology that we can use in the 21st century. But I want to now think about what we might want to use this technology for. And so to do that, I want to just circle back to John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth, both out-of-the-box thinkers, but still of their time. So John Bowlby famously talked about the fact that he was brought up mainly by nannies. He didn't see his mum except briefly every day. At the age of 7, he was packed off to boarding school. And later in the 1980s, he talked about the negative effects of boarding school. Well, back in the 1950s, he just thought this was completely normal. So this is a quote, and this was really at the time when he was developing attachment theory. Boarding school has the advantage of preserving the child's all-important home ties, even if in slightly attenuated form. And since it forms part of the ordinary social pattern of most Western communities today, the child who goes to boarding school will not feel different from other children. Isn't it amazing how what we think is normal? Although I have to say, it's not that long since our Conservative government was made up of, I think, something slightly more than half had been to the same boarding school. So something to think about. But what if we could measure attachment more simply, more rapidly? Could we then go into measuring attachment in extended families? So it's really back to my whole thing about knowing that I'm a herd animal, coming from a background where I have this huge extended family in the Caribbean who are so important to me. Could we actually look at that? What about, could we look at attachment and the way we actually support each other in zones? What is it about communities and being together that makes it more survivable? So many interesting questions to be asked. We think that suffering together and celebrating together helps to build. We think we would probably agree that we think that. We can argue when we get to questions, but how do we prevent ourselves fighting against someone else's community? So this is something that I've become more and more interested in, because I was so immersed in attachment as I was going through my career in the first 10 years or so as a scientist, that I really believe that attachment kind of answers all of our questions, and that it was all about how we can be good to one another. But then you begin to realise that there is a force that acts against that, and that's, I guess, what you could call tribalism. We tend to stick to our own communities, and we're not quite so nice to people from other communities, and that obviously that can then lead to war and conflicts. So what do we do about that? Well, there's another really great scientist who's mainly written in the 20th century, Sarah Blaffer Hardy. She's only ever written 2 books, but I would really recommend you read both of them. Do it when you're on holiday, because they're long, but they're so brilliant. This is her more recent book, Mothers and Others. And it's really all about who are those others beyond parents and infants who support parents and their children. And so her work really goes back to prehistory. It goes back to well before the 20th century. So she's written very compellingly about archaeological evidence, for example, from the Serengeti. So in the Serengeti in prehistory, apparently there's archaeological evidence that shows that there were various different tribes, but they generally didn't fight very often. It looked as if the various tribes were not particularly warlike. And what she argues, and other evolutionary biologists have argued, is that that was achieved through kinship bonds. So, for example, you might, your daughter might marry a guy from the other tribe, or your son might have a godparent from the other tribe. And so when resources become scarce and you kind of think maybe we should fight that tribe for those resources, you think, oh, wait a minute, my son-in-law's there. And so that actually inhibits fighting. So I would love to think about these kinship bonds and how they work. And a colleague of mine, Dennis Ugrin, has done written a fascinating paper. He and his colleague Emma Woodhouse spent a month in Tanzania with the Hadza community, which is a hunter-gatherer community. And they did a very, very well-validated, internationally well-validated measure of child mental health with 106 children in that community. What we found was that in those communities, which have really virtually no contact with urbanisation, the internet, mobile phones, etc., children generally have the same symptoms and traits as children would in the UK. But these traits are generally not a problem for the children. And so just speculating about this, Dennis and others discussed, is it because in those communities, every adult knows every child? So from the age of about 18 months, the children are all really cared for by the whole community. They're all out there. They can be seen every day by all the adults. So every adult kind of knows and keeps an eye on every child. Children take a lot more responsibility. So from the age of about 4.5, boys are out hunting with poison arrows. Girls are picking tubers with, I know I probably wouldn't want to be out hunt with the poison arrows, but that's another thing. But basically, children are taking a lot more responsibility. Adults work fewer hours. So most adults, on average, work about 4 or 5 hours and then sit around and chat and keep an eye on the kids. And that sounds really quite a nice life for children, doesn't it? Do wonder if that might be one of the problems for our children in the UK. Because we know that our children's mental health is deteriorating year on year in the UK. Suicide rates are increasing, and that's quite a contrast even with other European countries. So who are the others who can keep an eye out for our children with love? Do we urgently need to be thinking beyond our nuclear families? Who supports parents to support children? So, now this seems like a complete 360, but Ajahn here. Ajahn helped me and my husband get organise a lovely holiday in Kyrgyzstan a few weeks ago. And I was really, I had always wanted to stay in a yurt. And I just couldn't help thinking, so in Kyrgyzstan and many other countries across the long plains that really cross that huge continent with Russia at the top and then the subcontinent at the bottom, many people live in yurts, particularly in the summer. They'll take their herds into the mountains and live in yurts. And I was just thinking, how do people throw these things up? So let's have a look. This is a little bit of background for anyone that's not British, but we have a saying, an Englishman's home is his castle. So this is an Englishman putting up a yurt.
It's to the top of the trellis. Make sure that's correctly positioned. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.
He's got his nuclear family with him. You can see his rather fed up looking daughter.
5.
Twiddling her thumbs. She's banished. On his own. Okay, now. Let's just have a look at how it's done in Kyrgyzstan. Sunnier, sunnier. This is the same moment where the roof pole goes up. Is any counting necessary? Wouldn't that look a whole lot more fun? I'll just leave you with that to ponder. I was reading a detective novel recently, so I like to do to relax. And this is a quote from a character in a novel by Tana French about, and it's set around the time that Ireland had this big economic boom in the 2000s. Daniel says, take the national economic explosion as the most obvious example. That's come at a price, and a very steep one to my mind. We have sushi bars and SUVs, but people our age can't afford homes in the city where they grew up. So centuries-old communities are disintegrating like sandcastles. People spend 5 or 6 hours a day in traffic. Parents never see their children because they both have to work overtime and make ends meet. We no longer have time for culture. Theatres are closing. Architecture is being wrecked to make way for office blocks. And he goes on. So again, I just give you that to think about. Now, this is a well-known cliche. It takes a whole village to raise a child. That's been said for centuries across the world. Could we prove this with our new technology? Could we demonstrate whether or not this is the case? And if it is true, could we actually find out how to recreate it? Because I think this is probably what we need in the West. This is a podcast with Alessandro and I talking about the use and potential of artificial intelligence. And we focus this on the observation of child behaviour. Wouldn't it be interesting if we could start looking at attachment way beyond mothers and infants? What about dads? What about grands and granddads? What about aunties, big brothers and sisters? What about neighbours? Could we measure the atmosphere in workplaces? Don't always get them online. Could we measure the impact of rudeness or kindness? And people are starting to think about this more and more, but it is laborious to measure. So again, maybe AI could see Alessandro nodding, lots of ideas. Preparing this lecture really made me think about kindness. Kindness is described in the Oxford English Dictionary as the quality of being friendly, generous, and considerate. You've got to be kind as an active thing. It's not, you can feel love, but you've got to be kind. You can't really feel kind. You've got to do something about it. And I think one of the interesting things is that kindness is the key to all religions and also all spiritual traditions. We've got the humanists at the bottom there. You don't have to believe in God to believe in kindness. It seems to be good for us, and there's increasing realization that we actually can learn to be kind. So Civility Saves Lives is a fascinating charity, and it's been pulled together by emergency. It was initially by emergency physicians, but it's really spreading across the NHS, and we're kind of talking about it a bit in the university. They love an infographic, and this is just one of them. They really like to get research across. This was a study where there was a simulated operative crisis. In the middle of an operation, everything goes pear-shaped. If you have a polite surgeon, then 92% of the anaesthetists will be able to work reasonably even in a crisis. If you have a rude surgeon, less than 64% of the anaesthetists will actually be able to operate to a reasonable level. Now, if you're the patient on the table, that means you want a kind surgeon, even in a crisis. Could we go beyond our tribes? Could we actually understand how to welcome people from other cultures? I think we do have a bit of a tradition of that in Glasgow. I'm sure we could learn a lot more, but I love Refuigi, which is a Glasgow charity. If you're not from Glasgow, a Ouija is a Glaswegian, somebody from Glasgow, and a refugee is a person who, upon arrival in Glasgow, is embraced by the people of the city, a person considered to be local. Now, I'm sure there are asylum seekers and refugees probably in the room or listening, and you may not have had that experience coming to this city. At least we're trying. You know, there are organisations that are trying to be active about kindness. We don't quite have the technology yet to measure the joy of Christmas or indeed. But in the meantime, go well and be kind to one another this Christmas.
So thank you, first of all, to Professor Hellmanus. Thank you very much to Liz McCluskey for our excellent language today. So we have about 10-15 minutes of room for questions. So what we'll do is I'll take some from here, I'll take some from online and try to alternate them and try to get everyone involved. Would somebody get a question they'd like to ask Alan? I'll give people a start. Yeah, so can you talk a wee bit about, so obviously you had the images of the little girl in the sort of situation where she was a bit stressed, and as you said, that's partly healthy. What are some of the kind of ethical challenges that the field has faced in this context of we're putting children in this context, in this context where we're, it's very healthy, but we're crying.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, sometimes it is quite hard to get a strange situation procedure through an ethics committee. And as you can see, Kathleen nodding away, we've had real ethical challenges, really just getting child mental health research off the ground. I mean, I think mental health freaks everyone out on review committees, and children freak everyone out because we want to protect children. But for me, I think children have a right to have services which are as good as possible. And if we're going to develop good services, then we need to do research. And to be honest, I'm really led by the adaptive calibration model. Do you know what I mean? We don't have to wrap children in cotton wool. It's probably really not healthy to do that. Obviously, having your mum leave the room for 3 minutes is probably not going to kill. So I think it's fine. I think children can cope with a little bit of stress. And actually, if you talk to children, often they are so curious about understanding their own mental health and learning. I think we need to get better and better. Actually, I'm looking at it's really nice. We just got a colleague who started today is going to be working with us, thinking about how to involve children and young people in mental health research. And I think the more we can do that, the more we'll be able to calm the fears of the adults who want to be protective.
Questions from the floor? Gentleman there.
Please.
Hello. My name is Gordon. I'm a colleague who started. So from what I got from the presentation is about talking about the attachment theory and stuff. Would you say would you like to agree or disagree on like that attachment theory could be on the lines of collectivism and individualism? Because you gave the example of Kurdistan and Uganda, both the countries are collectivist societies, like close proximity to each other, and like, they have a very strong sense of community.
Yes.
Would you like to agree or disagree that it is on the lines of collectivism and individualism compared to more or less?
Well, I think it's such a great question. I'm so glad you asked it, to be honest, because I think we just don't know. My hunch tells me that a bit more collectivism would probably be really quite healthy for us all. That's my hunch. But what's really quite shocking is if you look at all of the research papers that have been written about attachment theory, the overwhelming majority have come from Britain, the United States, or Western Europe. I mean, the overwhelming majority. And so we need colleagues from other countries to be coming into the space. We need different cultural perspectives, and we need the technologies to be able to look beyond that individualist mother-infant interaction. I do actually feel that that's urgent. There are far more questions than answers. We need to go beyond those the kind of one-to-one intimate and understand intimacy in a wider range of relationships. So I think it's a really great question, but what I would say is it's a life's work. So please, anyone that's starting out in a research career, please join in and let's get involved in this, because we really need to know. Great question.
Questions?
So, Helen, you mentioned quite early on in your talk, cost-effective message. I was like, we've treated you well, Helen.
I was a health economist.
Bringing cost-effectiveness into your Christmas lecture. And I was just thinking about your point, particularly with the Virgin example. Are you sort of suggesting or alluding to the fact that attachment theory could almost be deemed, so interventions around it associated with attachment improvement, with attachment, including the surgeon example there. You talked about workplaces. Are you sort of thinking a bigger sort of theoretical model around the importance of developing those attachments in terms of this could be something which may be an effective and a cost-effective approach for, across society?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's so interesting because Sharon Graham, who's here, and who's our expert by experience leading the team, I mean, Sharon, you always say it's relationships, relationships, and relationships. And actually, I think in some ways in mental health, I think mental health science has been slightly poo-pooed because people see relationships as a bit soft and not very measurable. But actually, organisations like Civility Saves Lives have begun to be able to demonstrate and are collating research to show that you literally can save lives through sheer politeness. And that, if you have a rude person in the team, it almost brings the shutters down, you can't think. And there's a lot of, there's really robust science underpinning that, because we know how our stress responses work, and we know that we can get into the red zone and get brain freeze. So we really need to be delving into the nuances of this. And I think what's exciting about artificial intelligence is it actually has the potential. I mean, your whole work is about all of the different aspects of it. I don't know if you want to say anything about that, Alessandro, but what you would see as the potential for this.
So, yes, so there are actually studies at the level of social media, for example, which is a little bit the study of mobile phones, right? Where you can detect something about the language being used, the type of atmosphere there is. And in general, you can measure higher level of satisfaction, quality of life, or perceived quality of life. Where somewhat there is a little bit more evidence of tight communities. This is something you can measure by the sheer number of people you are in contact every day, or the variety. You are mentioning it takes a village to raise a child, etc. So having multiple connections, having multiple people around, one way or the other, in general, it's related to language that has to be a bit more positive, emotions that are expressed that are a bit more positive. Let's say that remain studies that are at the moment the effects are very small. Often it's because very large numbers leads in any case to observable effects. So there is a beginning, etc. The point is always what you measure. So funnily enough, we managed to do it now at the level of large population through mobile phones, etc. We all have them, social media, etc. More complicated at the level of individuals. It would be extraordinarily intrusive. And definitely more and more complex to consider. I don't know if that's someone.
So we have a question from online, which is, could you please speak to the theme of neurodiversity and the applications of measuring attachments?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think one of the things that's really frustrated me about the attachment field is that we haven't been able to have studies that have been large enough to look at the interaction between attachment patterns and neurodivergence. So, I mean, it just seems like a complete no-brainer to me that, if you're in a family where you're struggling with poverty, for example, and both parent and child have ADHD, and it's difficult to, both are finding it difficult to organise themselves, and the parent is then sanctioned by the benefit system, and everybody falls more into poverty. You can see that there's an interplay between neurodivergence and other factors that it's going to have an impact on the attachment relationship. But nobody's been able to do the studies of the size that can actually look at those nuances. So that's one of the things that actually really got me into thinking about how can we speed up these assessments of attachment? How can we make it much more efficient? Because then we could potentially be measuring attachment in big epidemiological studies with like 20,000 people. And then we could actually look at the benefits and the challenges of being somebody with ADHD or being autistic, for example. I mean, what I would say is we already do know that the overwhelming majority of people who are neurodivergent have a secure attachment. So the impact is small. You know, these are small effects, as you were saying. But there will be effects, and unless we can do these really big studies, we're never going to be able to tease that apart. So it's a really important question for the future.
So maybe take one more question online. Down here at the front.
Do you think, I thought it was a really fantastic lecture. I think it sounds like some really amazing like potential uses for this kind of technology in the future, but do you think that there could be some risks associated with scientists going into communities and, you know, maybe from the point of view of people in those communities judging whether relationships there are good or bad, or whether people there are nice to each other or not?
We do it all the time. We do it all the time, and it really bothers me. And the way to get around it is to make sure that those communities actually ask the questions. So these are questions that we develop together. Because at the moment, it really drives me mad. I think our kind of attachment science is very focused on observing, and we're often very quick to judge. So it's a really important question. I think the way to make sure that that's not what happens in the future is to co-produce, to work with communities.
Right. So last question, because we aim to finish up at 4. So the last question is quite random point. There is interesting research on the role of animals and the development of children with ADHD. I wonder, is there anything related to animals and attachment theory?
Yeah, well, I mean, we are animals. It's such an interesting question. Oddly enough, if you're interested, there's a lovely podcast that just came out last week. Oh my goodness, what's it called? Ponies for Children. There's a wonderful young man called Lee Lettuce who's actually worked with us quite closely, and he's talking about how the therapeutic impact for him of volunteering with Ponies for Children. So it's one of these. So, and he's talking about how much we can learn from the way that animals react to stress, and it helps us understand that fundamentally we are animals. It's not that complicated. You know, we don't always have to write academic treatises about things. You know, a dog or a goldfish can become overwhelmed just like we can. So yeah, I mean, I think it's really helpful for us just to remember part of the animal kingdom, like everybody else.
So thank you very much. We thank you. If everyone could give a wee thank you to Helen. To Lorraine Waddle and Audrey Dickey, who really helped organise this a great deal. Sorry I couldn't get through all of the questions. There are several more online too. But we hope to see you this time next year for the Christmas lecture again. Have a good break and see you in 2025. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz.
But forget
Given a name, you might.
I've got a name, but
Actually, that would really be better. I don't normally think about it.
it's even though we can make